Hello, hello. Welcome back, everybody. It is Bearded Joe and Basic Jason coming back in for episode number 2, Valhalla Bound podcast. We want to thank everybody that came out to the show on last Saturday. It was a 1 day show for the Sarasota Rep Today. We really appreciate you guys' support coming out. For those of you that came and talked to us about products or snakes, or maybe you bought something from us. If so, comment down below and let us know what you got or what you saw out there at the show. We do have upcoming shows as well. We're really excited about the next one, which is going to be in the place that I normally work, Lakeland. We've got the 13th and 14th for Lakeland. We have the 20th and 21st for Orlando. And then we have one of the biggest shows that they do down here, our direction, the Tampa show. That'll be February 24th and 25th. Today, we wanted to come in and talk about arboreals versus terrestrials. There's a lot of stigma that it surrounds the arboreal animals, and me and Jason pretty much almost exclusively work with arboreals. At least that's where it started for each of us. I know that I started with a lot of like ball pythons, blood pythons, the normal stuff that everybody gets into, like snakes, or if they want to breed animals, almost everybody goes ball python route first. They're really tolerant, it's easy. We'll probably do a video on them at some point because there's a lot of people doing them, but there's a plethora of information out there and lots of people that you can ask and talk to about it. However, there is not very much info or not very many people doing arboreal snakes. So I wanted to kind of go over and talk about the differences between care, the differences in caging and housing, feeding, and kind of eliminate some of those preconceived notions that people have about terrestrial or about arboreal snakes. Jason actually jumped right in the deep end, right off the bat. He wasn't playing around. He went head first into it, and you got your first arboreal snake as your first snake entirely, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I started right off with them. I skipped the Honda Civic phase, went right to the McLarens.
Yep.
Maybe not the McLarens, maybe like the Mercedes, because I started with the Amazon tree boa.
Right, right. Where did you get
Um,
your first one at?
I actually that the first one I got from you.
Okay, the
That
first
was
one was from me.
that was the first time I'd actually seen an Amazon tree boa at a show.
Okay,
I'm sure I'd seen them before, but no one had them displayed properly. They were just in little tubs and they were wild caught, so I just assumed they were a little python or something. They
right.
weren't distinctive enough for me to notice. But the first time I saw them for sale was at your show, and the next time I came in, I did my research a little bit, and then the next time I went to a show, you were there, you had them, and I was like, it's destiny. It's
That's
got to
meant to
happen.
be. How's that one doing?
Oh, that one's doing fine. That one's over a year old. I've had it for over a year and a half now,
Yeah, that
and
was a while ago then.
yeah, it's been a while and it's acclimated perfectly, no issues. It's funny that one has this huge enclosure because I like everybody, I only planned on getting one.
Oh.
So I was like, oh, I'll give it this. It's in like a 200-gallon enclosure, beautiful bioactive. It's fully spoiled.
It never works with just one. Not when you get into snakes. You always end
No,
up with more. What are you
it's
at now? How many do you have now?
oh, I won't even say that out loud. But probably close to 20.
But well, for podcast purposes, how many does your wife know that you have?
My wife knows that I have 10.
Okay,
But
perfect.
they're in tubs. I say they're not all full.
Yeah, yeah, I know how
Um,
that
it,
is.
with
I have
Amazons
lots of
too.
empty cages.
Exactly. With Amazons, it's real hard not to collect them all because wild caught ones come in all the time that you've never seen before. You're like, this is crazy. So you can get so much variety.
Yeah, that's and there's so much that's not known about the genetics behind or how the breeding works on arboreal snakes in general, and even within the differences. Like, there's lots of people who are not lots of people, but there are more people nowadays that are starting to get into them and work with them and breed them. But there's still so little that we know about the genetics that for me, it's kind of that excitement of you never know what you're going to get when you breed something when it pops out. Last year, or no, this year, I was able to reproduce my emeralds again. This is the second time, and the first year I had absolute standard across the board red babies, just red, all of them just looked like perfect normal emeralds, and then grew up to be green, a little bit high yellow going on, but mostly red to yellow and then green babies. This year, 10 more babies pop out. and 60% of them are bright green already for no reason whatsoever. I have talked to a bunch of people, and nobody really can tell me why that is. But I know that that same thing happens within the Amazons. Have you noticed any differences in the breeding between like genetics being passed on or anything like that? As far as your research has gone, I know that you're attempting to breed them and
Oh,
work on
oh
them.
yeah, it is a cluster trying to find any information on it because there's a few genetics that are known from what I understand, like the tiger gene.
Hmm.
We have a pretty good handle on that. And because I think it's been line bred since like the 90s. People have
Okay.
had tigers, but the calico is the only real talk in the Amazon game is the calico gene
Okay.
and the diversity of it. Are all red ones calico? Are these high white ones also calico? You'll see some Amazons that come in that are stunning white with bright red. And you're like, well, I guess that's a calico too, maybe.
Okay. Maybe.
And so everyone kind of has theories on it. I don't think anyone's really committed to saying anything yet about the
Okay.
calico gene.
It's all
Uh,
hearsay at the moment.
it's all hearsay because it's going to take a few more generations, I think, of people really working with them to
Right.
pull out what exactly is going on with these high white ones.
And even at that, as things are produced more often and more things are coming out, even once you get something nailed down, it could just be that they're polygenic and it's going to be random each time.
It could. One just came on online for sale that was yellow with white on it, like a white calico.
Okay. And
And
those and calicos are only supposed to be red, right?
correct. Or the only other option is it was albino.
Okay.
So, from what I understand, it went to a collector too, not even a breeder.
Oh, of course it did.
Yeah, that's what I heard. I don't know. I wasn't able to track it down. Some people who are a little more in touch with the Amazon community were all over it, trying to get
Okay.
it. I think it went up for sale for a few hours, maybe,
Wow. And
and I
then it
didn't
went
even see
quick.
what. Yeah, I didn't see what it sold for, but it that could be what an albino one looks like. All the pattern comes out yellow,
That's possible.
and then it had white in it as well, and the white was kind of going up the dorsal a little bit.
Okay.
So that's kind of the characteristics you look for with calico.
Interesting.
So yeah, so
Lots to be
you've got
learned.
these things that pop out all the time, and there's also this thing that's going on with this misnaming as well. You'll see them posted with like jaguar
Hmm.
morph. That's like the new one, jaguar.
Okay.
But it's just a patterned yellow.
Okay.
So if you see a yellow one, actually, I think you had one that or
Yeah.
have one that yellow one.
Yeah. Fat
That
yellow is
they're
what we
calling
called it.
that yeah, that fat yellow, fat yellow. That's right. They're calling that a jaguar,
Okay.
and you're like, okay, but there's no morph to it. It's not a genetic difference, probably.
Probably more likely just a genetic line.
Yeah, it's just patterned yellow. I mean, it's like they come out all the time from Suriname. Like you see them, I see like 15 a month come over. So that people are adding all these new terms to it. You see paradox thrown around a lot too.
Or
Yeah, you'll see a paradox and then you look at it and you're like, maybe, I don't know. And then you see some that you're like, yeah, that's a paradox.
right.
So who really knows what's going on with these things? And I think that's what's attractive to me, at least.
Exactly. That's part of the reason that I really enjoy the green tree pythons and the emerald side of things is that there is so little known about them as far as genetics and what there is available, what's really high yellow, what's really a reduced pattern. Like where do we draw the line on that? Some of mine are obviously reduced pattern because they do have the white. They're not an anaconda face, but they have so little white that it's obvious. And then there's other ones where yeah, it's got less white and it has a little more blue to it, but it's definitely not anaconda and it's got it does have all of the pattern there. So it's difficult to delineate where that line is until we get further and more generations in. If I breed these two that have a reduced pattern and then I get one without a pattern entirely, then there's something genetic there that's being passed on. There's something that's reproducible. And that just takes time. And with so few people doing it, it takes a lot longer than in like a ball python community where, oh, this looks like a gene. Oh, I crossed, I put it back to a normal and half of them came out a certain way. Now we can just drop it and now it just gets spread out and gets mixed into everything really quickly and we get a lot of data over a short amount of time. Especially in boas where they're breeding every other year and you're giving them a year off in between because their gestation is so long. and they have smaller litters and things like that, you end up taking a lot longer to produce enough data to actually prove anything.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to ask you a little bit because I don't know too much about python breeding because all I have are boas.
Hmm.
But from what I understand, almost every time I look at pythons, whether it be blood pythons, short tails, balls, there's even carpets. There's quite a bit of difference in the morphs, the colors, the patterns compared to boas in my limited research.
I would say that yes, other than the red tails,
Mm.
and now red tails have been bred in captivity far longer. They're kind of that middle ground where they're not as difficult as the arboreal things. They are more easily bred than like the larger species that need a lot more room and space in order to breed them. The true Surinames or getting into anacondas or things that are larger within the same family. So they've been done a lot more, and so we have again more data. I don't believe that everybody gives them a year off in between either, which would lean into being able to again produce more data more quickly and be able to prove out genes at a more rapid scale.
Yeah, because even
Uh,
like anacondas, what there's only a few morphs of them, right? There's kind of like patternless granite, and then you see the yellow greens of
yeah,
just the different species, but you don't see a whole lot of morphs with anacondas either, I don't think.
and maybe it'll come out over the coming years that there really just isn't that many morphs to be had in these species. Maybe we've kind of reached the terminal genes of what they can create. Not to say that there isn't some kind of, because every morph is a genetic defect in some form, right? It's a failed attempt at camouflage. Is the running theory of what the different morph patterns are? Is that it's a gene inside of them that at one point was like, let's test this out. Maybe this will help keep us alive longer. And it failed, and so it was repressed and never passed on. While in captivity, that's not an issue. And so over time, we end up reactivating these alleles and these genetics that allow these different patterns and colors to come out. And because they're not being eaten right away in the wild, those genes are able to be passed on, replicated, and heightened over the course of time.
So do you think maybe with boas, it's that there's so many different genes in there that it's hard to isolate? Like every time you
That could
pull
be,
two out, you're just getting such a combo. I mean, that's kind of how it is with Amazons. It would appear there's so much going on in there
yeah.
that you get when you pair up two and you get these babies that come out with such diversity.
Hmm.
You're like, that means they all have those same dominant traits.
Right. And when you look at the variety of places that these animals are coming from, right? Especially the Amazons themselves, the variety of locations, locales, scrub and shrubbery foliage areas that they're in, they go from those yellows and creams all the way to the reds, and then you've got like the dark garden phases, blacks and grays, with such a variety, right? It's hard to isolate down exactly what activated genes you're dealing with. And so with that plethora of combination, it could really just come down to that it's difficult to isolate specific genes without other ones being involved in changing things. One of the best examples I could think of would be from like ball pythons or blood pythons, things like that. If you take a like couple of different genes, a 3, 4, 5 gene male that you pick up as like this powerhouse you're going to breed to a bunch of your females, it's hard to tell what's all in him, depending on how many of those are pattern and how many of those are color genetics. Once you get that like mixture and that just bowl of soup genetics going on, it's hard to look at it and go, oh, that's a pastel albino cinnamon da 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 da. It becomes this. I don't even know what I'm looking at. Like what's happening here? And you could breed them out and make a bunch of different things, but it's hard to isolate and specifically breed for those items because the percentages gets less and less as to what you're able to produce with him.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's I heard the two that with genetic testing, and I don't know how true this is. This is something I just heard on a podcast recently. Was that for each genetic test they do, it costs $50,000 to get the equipment set up for that. So
really,
if they want to test for a new gene or test for I don't really know exactly what they're testing for, but each new one that they want to go for is like 50K investment.
wow,
So if you're trying to do gene testing too, it's like to get a company to invest the time, effort, and energy into it, it has to be viable.
yeah.
And the reason this was coming up was the podcast I was listening to. I think it was the Trap Talk.
Hmm.
He was mentioning Marcel Mendez has green tree pythons that are het for albino,
Okay.
possibly. But like, hey, why can't you go get tested? Have them tested for it. And you're like, well, there's only one person that might even have them, first off. So how do you drop 50K on them, developing the testing for something only one person needs?
Right.
I'm sure with the ball python community, though, they can scrounge that up pretty quick.
Yeah, some kind of GoFundMe or things to get something together and then test
Well,
for it.
yeah, if someone finds a new gene, it's so valuable.
Right.
It
Especially
could,
now that there's so many, finding something new. Again, we're getting to that point where what else could there possibly be? And it has to be something that's visually like attractive, right? Something that's super minute. They're not really worried about it, but they're looking for something that's visually like, wow, that's the next big thing. And there's so many things already that what's the viability? Like, what's it worth?
yeah,
Maybe
it's
not
that,
50.
and we all know that industry is spiraling. You go to shows, they're overbought. You know,
Yeah.
you don't see many people selling them. They're all 25 pages deep, . 30 pages deep on Morph Market.
Yeah.
It's just
There's
too
just too
much.
many. And it's not that they produce so easily that literally just about anybody can come in and reproduce ball pythons. You can mess up so many things and still get eggs and still have babies.
Yeah.
And so with that comes like an overabundance because when I first started ball pythons, God, forever ago, there really were only a couple of genes. And so if you produced a bunch of Enchies or albinos or you could move them, no problem, and you'd get good money for them. People wanted them. Over time, everything's price has come down just because of the sheer quantity of them that are available and the number of people that are continuing to produce them. At some point, the bubble was bound to burst and it was bound to start spiraling out of control. And now people are holding on to them forever. And there are still, every time I go to the show, it's not like people are like, ah, man, ball pythons, that's old news. It's like every time I go to the show, there's somebody else who wants to talk to me about breeding ball pythons and wants to be the next big thing. He's like, I want to breed these, I want to breed those, and I want to make $1 million. And I'm like, yeah, I once thought that too, my friend.
I think
And
that is that just an important step for all of us to take to be like, I
it might
think
just
I've
be the
got it.
learning curve we have
Yeah.
to run on. Like the track it's the Groven Road that we gotta follow in order to get to the next level.
Well, I mean, could you imagine starting with, green tree pythons?
Not those.
You know, I mean,
So Amazons,
mhm.
absolutely. If somebody was interested in snakes and wanted to go, like we've gotten a little bit more into genetics than arboreals versus terrestrials, but if we head back into that, right? Terrestrial snakes are the biggest known entity. Everybody knows how to care for a boa for the most part. There are a lot of new people still getting into it, and that's partly why we want to make these videos just to help newer people get started because this is a great hobby and a great passion of mine. But most of the people that are coming to shows and buying, multiple reptiles, they've got a basics of understanding for terrestrial animals. There's so little information when you research stuff online as far as arboreals go that people don't know how to get started, right? They don't know, like, oh yeah, I can throw a bunch of branches and things in there. Do I use lights, radiant heat thermostat? Do I use a like heat pad on the top? What do I put on the back wall of the cage? Like, what am I supposed to be doing here?
I mean, start with Amazons would be my.
Oh,
I think that's my
absolutely.
soapbox. We've talked about it before a little bit. They're like the Emerald Light version.
Yeah.
They're going to tolerate a much wider degree of husbandry.
Hmm.
Little too wet, little too dry, little too cold, little too hot. They're going to adapt pretty well, most likely because they occupy this huge range in South America.
Hmm.
They're able to be much more resilient than emeralds. I mean, I don't know if I'd say tenfold, but maybe.
It may be. I mean,
And
I've kept Amazons in rack systems. I've
mm,
kept them in arboreal style cages, similar to that I do my emeralds. I've kept them in glass enclosures, which I'm a huge proponent of. Let's not do glass; it's not the best thing for
yeah,
your animal. But they've tolerated all of those. The other thing is they with an emerald, it's so specific. Green trees are a little more resilient, I would say, than the emeralds as far as tolerating husbandry issues. But they also will that stress will build up in them and they'll have issues, right? So if somebody was looking to start with a species and wanted to preserve the space that they are going to utilize, arboreals would be the way to go. Caging an arboreal animal and working on vertical space is far easier than going into and doing a large horizontal or terrestrial style spacing. My take on
Absolutely. Like
that.
I've always, ever since I got into Amazons, I think arboreals are definitely better for people than a lot of people think,
Yeah,
especially in the hobby as a total. How many people, when we're doing a show, have 30 animals, then come up and they're so impressed that we have arboreals?
right.
You know, they've got these full collections, but they still haven't started with a single arboreal yet.
Hmm.
Boas, they've got pythons, they've got corn snakes, colubrids, all kinds of stuff. And they're like, "Ooh, I hear they're kind of bitey, or I hear they're hard to keep."
Yep.
And I mean,
And what's the thing that there's the biting, right? That's the
hmm,
thing that keeps people. They're like, oh, I heard they're real aggressive. They're real bitey, right? The other thing that people we'll talk more about the biting thing in a second. The other thing is that one, then two, then 22, right? When you're exploding that quickly and you're collecting all of these different morphs and localities and getting more specialized, you're getting excited about it, you're collecting more animals. Terrestrial things that you can keep in a rack system and a drawer system is easier initially, right? If you're collecting like that. And so people get really excited and they buy a bunch of rack systems and they put a whole bunch of animals in there and they're like, ah, yeah, look at all of my different variations of the ball python, right? Nothing wrong with that. I was that guy for a long time. But at
not me.
some point, everybody goes, I really just, they're in a drawer all the time. I wish I could see them, right? And so then they start going with pages more like these and they want to see them. But that's when that like tipping point happens. And it's like, wow, if I want to set them up so that I can see them, I have no room. I'm out of space. And that's when an arboreal animal, if you're looking for something that is like able to be visualized more often, you can see it crawl around its cage and enjoy its environment and things like that. An arboreal is going to allow for that. They're going to be out and more active, or even if they're just sitting in one spot, they're they are visualizable. You can see them. In doing a vertical cage inside of an area of space like this back here, I have to stack things up. So at some point, my short ass can't see what's in the top shelves here. I got to get up on a ladder just to see them anyway. So what was the point of the visual? They're large colubrids, and they need to be. These guys are diurnal; they're active all the time. So I need to have them in something like this, or they get antsy. Versus my arboreal stuff, I can fit twice as many animals, almost this size, by doing vertical spacing and having multiple layers of perches in the same amount of space.
I 100% agree. And you and I have rooms that are dedicated to these. But if people
Right.
don't have rooms, if
Not
you're putting
everybody.
something in, yeah, if you're putting something in your living room, especially if you're only going to have one or two, I think vertical space looks way better
Hmm.
than horizontal. Personally, I think it doesn't take up as much space. The enclosures can be a little more expensive.
Right. On initial setup for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And when we talk about the biting, because to circle back on those, especially
Right.
with emeralds, Amazons, anything Corrales,
Yes.
you're, I hate to just blanket statement say you're going to get bit because that's not true.
Right.
Especially with captive bred. We really have to delineate those two,
Delineate
right?
between.
We have to
Right.
differentiate between them. With wild caught, you're probably getting bit.
Gonna happen
If you're bringing in a wild emerald, a wild Amazon, you're probably going to get bit.
more than
Uh,
once.
More than, yeah, they're not happy with you
Now
and they're
it
not afraid to show it.
right. They each have their own kind of approach to defending themselves. Emeralds are gonna kind of wait and tolerate and like just like listen, man, I really don't want to do this to you, but if you keep fucking around, I'm gonna do it. And when they hit hard.
Because they got nuclear bombs.
They literally do. Those muscles are huge. Those teeth are very large, and when they bite, you know it. Versus green trees, Amazons, things like that, they do this more tentative tapping where there's
Yeah.
just like, hey, back up, man. Like, no, no, no. and it's more of a repetitive tapping. It's not a very traumatic bite, but it doesn't feel good, right? And again, wild caught versus captive. I always tell people, if you think about anything that you're trying to deal with, any behavior that you're trying to deal with from your animal, why is the animal acting that way? What is he thinking? So, if I came over to your house today, Jason, in a white van with a mask on, and I jumped you, stuffed a mask over your head, threw you in the back of the van, then I taped you into a box and I shipped you for 2 weeks overseas somewhere. You woke up in Paris or Africa or somewhere. No, you have no idea where you are. You haven't eaten. You haven't had anything to drink. You're probably not gonna like me after that, right? So now anybody with a beard who and a bald head like me, you're just like, nah, screw that guy. I don't like that type of guy.
Anybody who opens the box, honestly,
Whoever
catching
opens the
these
box is
hands.
getting some, right? You're coming out swinging. So when you think of it from the animal's perspective, that's essentially what they've gone through. And it's terrifying. So of course they're not real big fans of humans after that point. Now, that can be overcome. It's not to say that wild caught animals shouldn't be in the trade. It's not to say that like they can't learn to tolerate human interaction, but there's always going to be some sort of weariness to them where they're nervous until you can establish a relationship with them and establish like an understanding that hey, I'm not here to hurt you, man. Like you're here, let me take care of
Yeah, of all the Amazons I have, wild caught
you.
of the captive bred, not a single one bites.
Right.
None of the captive breds have ever really bitten me, besides an odd circumstance.
Right.
The wild caught
Accidents
ones,
happen.
I've never had a wild caught one that I couldn't get to be calm enough to handle.
Right.
So I think it's mostly a myth because of how many wild caught ones were dragged in.
Mhm.
And part of me thinks that the reason they bite more than emeralds is that they do better as wild caught. They come over healthier
That's true.
and ready to go. A lot of these emeralds you see come over wild caught and they look like they've been fist fighting the whole way. You
Yeah.
know, they're scarred up, they've got no muscle and they're behind their head anymore. You know,
They're
they look kind of
atrophied
rough.
and they're dehydrated and
Yeah.
it's probably the same way initially, but it's like those Amazons bounce back way
Yeah,
more efficiently.
they come back, you feed them, you get them some water and they're ready to fight.
Yeah, they're right back on the wagon.
But so you've had two litters now of emeralds.
Hmm.
Of all the emeralds that you've grown up from captive bred, are any of them aggressive?
None of the captives that I have, obviously, as little tiny babies, they look like a skittle, and they think everybody's going to eat them. So as babies, they're like, ah, shit, every time you open the cage. Really quickly, that changes. Eventually, like, they're eating off of the tongs for me, and they come right out, and they're like, is it food? And I put my hand in front of them. Nope, not food. And I can pick them up. I have a 2-year-old here that is from the litter 2 years ago, and an absolute doll. Can just
Oh, is
reach
that
in,
I have
pet
the
the
sibling.
head. You have the sibling, yeah.
Yeah,
The
man,
sibling.
mine is I can reach my hand in there, grab 24/7. No, I can do it at night. I can do it anytime. I've never been bit. I could hand it to a kid.
Right. And talking about that, there's an established relationship from the time of birth. That relationship can also be established with a wild caught animal. My female that I've bred the last 2 years, even when she's pregnant and has every right to just be grumpy about being handled or like checked on or anything like that, I can still reach in and pick her up. And it's because of the established relationship that I have with her. She understands that I'm not there to hurt her. I haven't done anything to have a negative impact on her care or her handling along the way. I've kept it low key and just enjoyed having the animal. These aren't necessarily something that is going to be thrown around your neck and go to the store with, right? It's not necessarily something that you're going to let your kids sit on the couch with and just play with because if it's a wild caught animal, he's going to have a little bit of that dog in him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But captive bred stuff, you probably could get away with acting like that and doing some more recreational handling with them. But even with the wild caught animals, it's you're able to establish that and it's a lot of it by understanding how the animal thinks. Just like I said before, recognized that the only time I was being bitten with my emeralds was that I was trying to get them off the branch to do some kind of like moving them out of their cage to feed them or some sort of health check or trying to work on handling because I wanted to tame them, right? I wanted them to be handleable. And I was getting bit every single time I tried to mess with. And so I finally just it was like I gave up. I go, I'm not doing it anymore. I don't want to be bit. I don't want to stress them out. They're getting stressed because of it, and it's not necessary. I don't have to hold them to enjoy them. So I designed a perching system that's removable. I could put them on a little stand, clean the cage, do my thing, put them back. And it was probably just a couple of months into me doing that and just not creating a negative interaction source with them that one of them came off and started coming to me. I stuck my hand out and did the please don't bite me lean and ran up my arm, was on my head, on my neck, and I was like, holy shit, what just happened? What? And then I was like, wonder if the other ones are calming down. And I went to each of my cages, and now everybody was calmer. Not all of them are puppy dogs like my big girl is. My male will let me know when he is done with the handling process, and he only has one way of communicating that. So
I do the same.
occasionally he
Yeah,
gets antsy and swings, but
I do the
I
same
can
thing
still
with
get
my
him out.
Amazons. I do the removable perches, and ever since you kind of started that, I went to the same way. All my perches are removable, and I never pull the snake off of the perch while they're inside their enclosure.
Right,
I pull the perch out, and then I work getting them off at their own kind of pace,
right. Kind of let
where
them
they're
do
like,
it
"Oh,
as their own
the floor
process.
is right here. I'm going to another perch." Like they're comfortable with it.
Right. It kind of
And
let it be their decision.
yeah, I mean, the difference you're gonna find a little bit though is Amazons are sometimes not tree boas.
Right.
There's sometimes they're Amazon ground boas, it would appear.
And I think that's going to have something to do with the locality. But let me tell you that it stressed me out because my primary animals were green trees and emeralds. And when an emerald or a green tree is sitting on the ground, you are so far up Shit's Creek. It's a
It's
problem.
just the end, right? Pretty
You
much.
have things you have things to fix, and you got to fix them now because
Yeah.
he's not happy and he's stressed. Versus, I couldn't get the damn things to perch for the first couple of weeks I had them.
Hmm.
They wouldn't go on the perch. They just sat in the corner, and then they'd move around their cage and be up climbing at night, and then right back into the corner. And I was like poring over whatever I could find and asking people, and most of the answers I got was, "Yeah, they just do that."
They're real diverse in what kind of environment they'll acclimate to. I've got those two giant enclosures,
Hmm.
and it's 50-50 on where they sleep if it's perched or on the ground.
Yeah,
And they perch very similar to how they sleep on the ground. They coil up. They don't do the same as the emeralds.
right.
They
It's not
like
that like photographic coil.
no, they like to really be secure.
Mhm.
I'm guessing they don't go as high in the tree either. They seem to be like more even the lower perches that I have
Yeah,
than the highest one. The
yeah,
only reason they go to the high one is for basking.
right.
You
Usually
know,
after eating or something like that.
yeah. And then we talk about even heating them. So heating arboreals. I know you use radiant heat panels, right?
Yeah, that's the primary source that I like to use. I've used lights, I've used heat pad like for really small enclosures, I've used like a heat pad stuck to the top of it, but nothing's been as efficient really as the radiant heat panels for me.
And that's I kind of use a variety. The room stays close to 80, which is kind of the bottom level of what they like, 80 to 84. So I kind of use my room temperature, and then I do have a light system on the big enclosures
Right.
just to give them a day night cycle
Mhm.
and also heat. And then I just have heat tape on the other ones because they're in that like a giant arboreal rack system.
Right, right. I remember
And
the rack system you developed. It's like, is it back heat or is it bottom heat?
it's back heat for
Back
them.
heat.
And you'll see a diversity of where they're at in the enclosure. They'll vary between in the wintertime, you get them smashed up against the far side, getting as much heat as they can.
Yep.
And then in the summer, they're kind of plastered at the front. So I adjust the gradient until they're not slammed on either side.
Right.
And they
Yeah.
they they seem to do fine in it. I mean, I'm fairly confident you could keep them in anything.
I think they're probably the most diverse of the arboreals, right? Of the species that are tree livers or tree climbers, the ones that are going to be found in those areas. They definitely are the most diverse. But if you look again at their range in South America, it's a huge variety. So I think that we're going to learn more along the way as far as the localities and specifics. Like you go to Green Tree side, everybody knows the localities of green trees: the Jayapura, the Sarong, the Biox, the Arus. So we know that color pattern wise, we can kind of delineate based on what they look like, but they all kind of act the same. And it's because they all kind of live in the same environment. Despite the different islands and localities that they're from, the environment that they're in is all very similar. Versus the Amazons, there's a massive range and a different type of like environment that they're living in. So whether it's like low shrub grassland to the taller rainforest trees, they're found in all of those areas. And I think over time we're going to find that more of the localities are going to be the grassland style are going to be more prone to lay on the ground and to
And
hide there.
from what I
Uh,
understand from importers is they're so common over there
mhm,
that they pull out hundreds of them a day. Like
right.
they're everywhere. I mean, they're consistently pulling these things out. And so they're like I don't even know what snake you could compare them to in North America
Well, I
that's
mean, if
that
it's in
prolific.
Florida, you just compare it to the iguanas.
Yeah, oh yeah, compared to the
They're
iguanas, where you
everywhere.
just every
You
the
just
natives know about it. It's not a shock. You're like, oh, another Amazon tree boa, or
yeah,
they just probably call them tree boas.
yeah.
And have you been down to Miami and seen the infestation over there?
So I've been down to Miami and seen the spiny tail iguanas.
Yeah,
I was surprised to not see as many green iguanas as I expected. I saw tokays. I've heard from friends who live down that way about the panther chameleons, the veiled chameleons just being everywhere. But the last time I was down that way, it was like spiny tails. They
yeah,
were everywhere down there. And
everywhere.
they were like evident as the anoles that we are used to here in Florida, the Jamaican anoles and the green anoles that we used to have. I mean, they were literally just everywhere.
I mean, I've always said if something can survive in Florida, it will thrive in Florida.
Right.
If it can make it through our summers and our winters, it's gonna do well.
The
Nothing
winters are
struggles.
the winters are the most difficult, I think, because we're so wet down
Hmm.
here, right? Normally, other places that reptiles are going to live, it kind of the humidity kind of stays consistent, whereas we're wet and that humidity like drops and fluctuates so
Hmm.
rapidly. Our soil doesn't hold humidity very well at all. It's all sand. And so with those fluctuations, animals get sick and animals can have issues during the winter seasons more easily than they could in a slightly more tropical where the foliage and things are going to kind of retain. It doesn't help that we've
So,
paved everything in concrete, but
so if I'm so then probably, and I don't know this, I haven't done any research, but I'm guessing that things from South America don't do well in Florida because of our winters,
I
but
would say
things
not as well. It does get
com-
colder there, but it retains their
compared
humidity.
to like Burma though with the Burmese pythons.
Hmm.
So those things do okay in the Florida Everglades.
Right.
Because so Burma must have a similar climate
To Florida.
to
Yeah.
us. And that's more so those are Asian countries
Yeah.
where you're going to be
And
finding more of the Burmese pythons and
yeah.
even green tree pythons, right? Where because where's their range?
So, as far as I'm aware, green tree pythons are going to be more so New Guinea
Mm,
and the coast of Australia.
okay.
So, not necessarily India or Indonesia there. I'd have to do more research because I am not a geography major.
Mm.
But as far as I'm aware, New Guinea and the coast of Australia is going to be more so where green tree pythons would be
So I
found.
wonder if those could survive in South Florida,
Maybe.
because
Um, I mean, so the other thing is to quote a great movie, "Life will find a way." Reptiles are resilient, and they may not do great, but they will survive, right? A good example of that would be the caimans and things that we have down here, right? The Florida Fish and Wildlife is really specific. They're getting more and more laws and they're getting more and more strict about what species you can and can't keep here in Florida because they're worried about these species overtaking and going all the way to South Carolina and just ruining the natural ecosystem. My hot take on that is just because an animal's surviving here does not mean it's reproducing appropriately or doing well, right? So a friend of mine lived in Texas, used to breed dwarf caimans out there. He bred a bunch of other crocodilians as well, but specifically his dwarf caimans are his passion. He worked with a bunch of them, and he would just let them maternally incubate in the mound that they build, and they'd be fine. Babies would hatch out, he'd go net them out, throw them in a separate bin, and good to go. He comes down here, and for almost 10 years, he struggles with getting them to hatch. Dead babies in the eggs, infertile eggs, like nothing would develop, or it would partially develop, and then right around the time, a couple weeks before it's supposed to hatch, it looked like they were dying, and then all the eggs would stink and it'd be bad. And so that was kind of how I got into doing my hours with him, as he was asking me, "What am I doing wrong here? Like, is my female too old? Like, what do you think's happening?" And I said, "I think it's just our soil. I think it's just that our soil's inability to hold and retain humidity and temperature well enough. when our temperature does drop for the short amount of time that it drops, it plummets. And so the soil does the same thing because it doesn't retain any of the moisture or the temperature. And so you end up with the babies dying and the eggs partially developed. So when we pulled that first egg cycle and the egg group clutch into his incubator inside and set him up to incubate, all 14 of them hatched.
Mm,
And so just because these animals are out there and they're living here and is an invasive species doesn't necessarily mean that they're propagating and doing well.
mm.
I think that these animals live 35 to 45 years time. And so it gets out and it will live its full life and it will survive, but not necessarily breed and reproduce at the rates they would in their native habitat. Because if we're basing our math off of what we know of them in their native habitat, and we estimate they're going to have this many eggs and this is the percentage of survival rate, and it's all based on native habitat. And we're not taking into account that this is not their native habitat. And there are
Interesting.
fluctuations and differences that could be affecting their reproductive rates.
So maybe not everything from Florida thrives. Like maybe it's just because we see so much news about the pythons and the lizards, the iguanas, the things that take over South Florida, that we just assume that if it can live here, it will just take over.
Right.
And when I
And
was
not to
in
say that
Miami,
some won't, but
yeah, because when I
I
was in
don't think
Miami, we were driving down and you could see iguanas in the trees as you're walking, and we didn't even have our eyes peeled. It was just
right.
like, oh, there's an iguana, and like iguanas are cool to me.
Yeah.
I grew up thinking they were the coolest and seeing like acquaintances who had them as pets. So seeing them in the wild is stunning.
Right.
I say wild when seeing them in downtown Miami is
Right.
odd.
Right. The
You look
wilds
up at
of downtown Miami.
yeah, you're like walking down, downtown Miami and you're just seeing all the craziness that Miami is. And then you tack on the fact that the light poles have iguanas on
That's
them.
6 foot lizards on them.
And you're like, could this place get any weirder?
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
Florida.
and that's Florida. It's perfectly epitomizes Florida.
Yep. So let's discuss a little bit about the differences in how we set things up, right?
Mm.
We had talked about how initially expenses might be a little bit higher for setting up an arboreal species, and I would say that that's probably related to us wanting to set things up so visually, right? When you have this, a certain amount of space this way and a certain amount of space this way, and you're going short because it's a terrestrial species, they don't need a lot of height. You really limit yourself as to what kind of decor you can put in there, right? When you go up, and now the live plants, the rock features, the background, all this other stuff starts coming into play, right? Now, that's where I think the extra money comes in. I think that's how people they're like, oh, well, the setup is way more expensive to set them up. I don't know that it necessarily has to be, right? I'm old school and I've been doing this a long time. So my setups are way different than yours. I love your setups. Your setups are beautiful. And I've considered taking a couple of mine and having you come over and decorate them out for me because I love the visuals and the pictures that
Mm.
you get with those animals. However, being that I started this in a time when we didn't have a lot of good medicine and we didn't have a lot of good vets and people that could assist with any issues along the way, I keep my animals fairly sterile. Very minimal bedding, very minimal foliage. As long as the animal is happy, eating, thriving, doing its thing, it's defecating well, it's drinking water, it's reproducing, then I consider it to be stable and satisfied animal that is living a full life. And that's kind of how I keep them versus going with the more elaborate designs like you have in some of yours. And I know you have
Yeah,
some similar to my setups as well.
and there's definitely if I was gonna say to anyone who wants to set up a giant, beautiful bioactive enclosure, get the snake that you want in it and keep it alive first in a
Right.
tub. Okay. And so that way, if you put it into something else and it starts having problems, you know that it's your husbandry.
Right.
If you just buy a snake and day one throw it into a bioactive enclosure and it starts having issues, who knows what the problem is?
That makes sense.
I mean, you don't know if it's got a respiratory infection because of your husbandry, because it came in this way. So I suggest a 6 months to a year, you keep it in a very sterile, bare bones enclosure, get it eating so that oh, it skips every third meal approximately, no big deal.
Right.
These things. But if you just slap it in this huge enclosure and it's not eating for you, it's not shedding properly, you know, or God forbid, it gets mites. or
I
has
mean,
mites.
it was at the show, right? You bring it
Yeah,
in,
and
you
now you
don't
have
notice it.
to.
You built this beautiful
Oh,
enclosure, all the live plants, everything's great in there. And then you throw it in, and then you pull it out a week later, and you're like, holy shit, there's a whole bunch of mites on this thing. And you have to tear that whole cage apart, and all of your soul dies with
I,
it.
you only really have two options with it. Because I've thought this through. With the one of the enclosures I have, it would be impossible for me to take it apart. From a physical, emotional, maybe even spiritual perspective, I could not do it.
Couldn't do it.
So I already thought if that snake had mites, I think I would take the snake out for like 2 years and just
And
have
just
all
let
the mites
everything
die
dry
off.
out.
Like all the mites would have to die off, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what are they
Just
going to
leave it
eat?
empty. I mean, you just have to gas it over and over again. And
Oh, I mean, I would move it to another room and
yeah,
then just let those mites die off because they can't live on no blood, right? No, they
you gotta
have to
have some
have
food
they
source.
got to have something. So I would just starve them out,
You just
and
have to
then I
put
would
the whole
teach.
thing, like seal it somehow.
Oh, I mean, can how far can the mite travel?
I don't know. I'd have to look that up, but I'm assuming. I mean, back in the day, I've had them move from rack system to rack system and cage to cage. You bring one snake home, you don't treat it properly, and then all of a sudden you got it in all of your cages. And
I
so,
would have sticky traps everywhere. It would be like Alcatraz to get out of that enclosure, dude.
just
I've
setting up
thought
your own
about
little
it
mouse
because
trap.
when I saw that my giant enclosure and none of them had mites, thankfully, whenever I checked them, but the fear hit me like, oh no,
Yeah,
I have to tear this thing apart.
that would be bad.
Oh,
So
but
whereas in my more sterile environments, my
just
tub
whoop,
setup that
wipe
I've
them down.
take everything out, everything goes in bleach, spray the whole thing down with the mite killer spray, wipe it out, and then gas it, and then leave it for 30 minutes, and then everything goes back in and everything's fine. They also don't move as easily, I've found, versus a traditional glass style aquarium where you've got a whole open screen top. Things crawl right up and out of there. Versus in my other tub systems, it's more enclosed to maintain my humidity. So
Hmm.
I find that things don't travel as far if anytime I've brought something home from the show and might have had mites, I haven't had any transference between cages as
Yeah,
often.
because it'd have to get out of one and then into another.
Right. It
So
just
it's
makes
got
it more
two
difficult
obstacles.
for sure. So with with my setups, I like to do more of a that radiant heat panel on top. And a lot of people want to know like how do you regulate that? And my answer is always the pi meter. It's always a thermostat of some kind. Whether you want to spend a ridiculous amount of money on a thermostat, or you want to spend $30 on a thermostat, as long as it is going to maintain and do its job of regulating the heat source. Created my products, the branching systems that I have, so that I can put my thermostat right into the branch and monitor something that sits right underneath. That way, they have one spot that's the hottest, and then the rest of the cage is kind of ambient around the 78, 80 degrees that my room stays at. And then I just monitor my humidity by spraying as often as it needs to be done. In my tub style setups, I don't have to do that as often. Anything that's housed in glass, I end up spraying a lot more so that I can keep my humidity between 60 to
I mean,
70%.
I went super cheap on the thermostat for mine because I don't actually need it to be super accurate because I'm using a gun to test the temperatures.
Hmm.
So what that thermostat says isn't important. What's important is how hot it is in the enclosure, right?
Right.
So once you
Exactly.
figure that out, what you actually just need is a good timing system.
Hmm.
And so as long as it doesn't freak out on you, I mean, mine, I got a real cheap one. I think you use some of those as well.
Yeah, the
Those,
pine meter
those,
ones, the white
yeah, yeah.
ones. Yeah.
I mean, they're horses too, man. Mine's lasted for years.
Hmm.
They're $30, and I've never had any issue.
Yeah.
Now, you and
I've
I have heard of people
yeah, I've heard of other
that,
people having issues with them, and my thought process is that it's one-off issues with the thermostat itself, which can happen. It can happen with your heat source. It can happen with your
yeah.
thermostat. It can happen because the plug in your wall isn't grounded properly. But I think the ones on my green trees over here, I've had for 3 or 4 years now.
Oh,
They've been just plugging away, no problem.
you could replace them several times over for the cost of some other companies.
Right, at $30, I could replace them 5 times for the price of a thermostat.
Yeah. And, when I look at it, like I said, it doesn't have to be accurate. It just has to,
It just has to maintain.
it just has to maintain as long as you use a gun to make sure that all the temperatures are where they're supposed to be.
Yeah,
It doesn't really make a difference.
because the temperature that I'm getting inside my cage isn't what I always have my thermostat set at.
Correct.
Depends on where it is within my room, depends on how close it is to the window, where my ventilation's hitting, things like that. So, like my rack system over here for the baby emeralds and things, I want them between like 83 and 84 degrees. I think I have it set at like 85 or 87, and then the temperature on the inside of the enclosure is slightly less than that.
Hmm.
So, as long as it holds and keeps giving the same amount of power to the heating source, and I'm getting consistent readings on my temp gunning, then that's not a problem as long as it just maintains what it's doing.
Yeah, and that's when I had multiple enclosures next to them, next to each other, that all had heat sources. I actually had to lower the temps for the one in the middle
Yep.
because it was getting cooked from either side.
Yeah.
So the ones who were in the middle were getting absolutely cooked, and the ones on the outskirts were freezing. Because so I have to even adjust temperature based on where they're at in my room, like you said.
Yep.
I've got that Uromastix that
Yeah.
sits at
That'll heat your whole
130.
room up.
Everybody who's near the Uromastix is hot. That's
Yeah.
just how it is. He's 135 degrees on his basking spot, and so everybody near him gets some heat. So you have to really take each enclosure individually. That's why I think trying to set up giant setups with a bunch of like monolithic
Hmm.
structure can be tough based on your room. Because
Right.
if the top gets hotter than the bottom, or if the one closer to, if you have an air vent,
Yep.
you know. So sometimes, even though it's harder, you have to set up individual enclosures,
Yeah.
especially arboreals,
Right.
where you're
Setting up
talking they're
those,
sensitive.
yeah, and regulating things individually. I don't think I have any arboreal racks. I have several rack style systems where they're all built almost identical. But each set of them is on their own individual thermostat,
Yeah, that's
right?
that's what I do.
That way, hey, the pi meter does dual sourcing, right? So it's got two plugs and two temperature probes, and it's got two regulating sources inside of it. So even though those two are wired together, technically, they're on their own individual thermostat. And so just because the cage on the left needs to be set at 86 doesn't mean the cage on the right doesn't need to be set at 85. And it's just again based on airflow, based on where it is in the room, how close it is to the window, how efficient that heat source is. Some of them might have different heating sources, or one heating source might be older than the other and not put out as much heat as it used to. So just itemizing and making them individualizing, I guess is the word I'm looking for.
Hmm.
Individualizing each animal's care and its environment to make sure that it's optimal for them. Because then it can also come down to the species, the animal themselves. Some of my green trees don't like it at 83 degrees. Some of them prefer it at 85, and some of them are like, if it's 85 degrees, I'm not eating. I'm mad.
Ooh.
So the individual animal will kind of let you know over the course of time what their favored temperatures and ranges are.
Yeah, I've got one Amazon that I've never seen it anywhere but as close to the heat source as possible.
Hmm.
I mean,
You
I
just
don't
make it a
know.
permanent.
Yep, he likes it hot. I don't know where he's from. By coincidence, he's also a dark red color, so maybe there is something to the locality and what kind of temperature they like and the
Yeah.
color. Who knows? But he definitely loves the heat. And then I have one other Amazon that definitely prefers it to be more like 82, 83 degrees.
I think we're going to learn more about locality along the way and how it
And they'll
affects.
tolerate, yeah, they'll tolerate that
They'll
spectrum, which is
tolerate
nice.
either, right? The other snake, he might prefer it hotter, but even if you have him at 90, 95 degrees up at the top end of his enclosure and he's still sitting underneath it, if you had him at 85 and he was still sitting up top, as long as he's eating and doing his thing, he'd tolerate it. And now, an emerald in that same care, he would say, absolutely not. I'm done with all of this. I would rather starve.
You could tell your emerald you were going to do that and it would just die.
They
You
would
wouldn't even
just
have
give
to
up.
do it. You could just mention it in the room that you're thinking of
Yeah, I'm
increasing
in
the
my room right
temperature.
now. I have to talk a little quieter so they
Yeah,
don't think I'm changing
I swear
temperatures
those
in
things
here.
can hear you. I mean, the people who import those in mass, I feel for them that
Yeah,
try to keep them alive. That's a real, I know you've done it a little bit,
yeah.
and that's hard work.
There have been successes and happy days, and there have been sadness and sad days, and there are still good days and bad days here. I still have two of them that they're here, and part of my desire to have them is what got them imported and brought over here. I am part of the problem, right? I'm part of the problem that I want these animals, and so if there's a if there's money to be made, people will make it, and they don't care about what the animal is going to go through or have to deal with. If I'm willing to pay for it, they're willing to get it here, right? So I bought these animals, and I should. I feel sometimes I feel like I should have given up on them a long time ago. And then the other side of me is that no matter what, I got these animals here and I purchased them, and I'm going to do everything that I can to keep them alive and happy. I still force feed two of them. I give them a puree diet just to make sure that they have all the nutrients, vitamins, and things that they have. And I will, if I have to do that until the day they die, then I will, because I want the animals to do well. And I want them to have the best life that I can provide for them, even if I've changed everything and tried all the tricks to get them to eat. I have a vet that comes in and checks on them every so often and makes sure that they're okay, but they're just difficult,
Hmm.
and it can be a trying thing to deal with a wild caught animal.
I think that there's a lot of camaraderie amongst the arboreal breeders
Oh, more so than the other communities.
because they know what you it's like being a war vet, like
Yeah,
there's just this bond you see between those people when you're like, oh, you've also tried to breed emeralds.
I'll never forget. I put a post on that was like, "Hey, I'm trying again this year to breed my green tree pythons. Any and all advice is accepted. This is what I'm planning to try. Let me know if there's any tweaks I should make." Just made like on one of the forums, and like the first post that pops up is, "It's okay to cry." And boy, were they right. I did successfully breed that year, and I did have four baby green trees that came out. But those four baby green trees were out of 13 or 14 eggs that I had. Most of them didn't make it, and that was also losing another animal and an entire clutch to egg binding. So it's one of those things that you could do everything right with green trees and still have bad luck with it. So anyone who has attempted and gone through the process of doing it is very much aware of the difficulties that it entails.
And we circle back to why Amazons are a great first arboreal. You don't hear these horror stories
No.
from Amazons. The only horror story you hear is I've been putting two females together for the last 2 years.
Yeah,
And even though we live in a very modern time, it's still not working.
right. And then or you hear about the breeding things that we discussed earlier in the show here. You hear about, oh, I've got these two over here that aren't red at all, but when I pair them together, I get nothing but red babies. But when I take these two red ones over here, that should make red babies, I get normals, and I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's the most common conversation I hear from people. Most people breed them once and that's it. From the general variety of people I found that deal with Amazons, they breed it once. They're like, that was fun. I don't know where to go from here. Like,
Right.
what do
What
you
now?
hold back if you get a litter of normals?
Right, because if it is truly polygenic,
Yeah,
you the likelihood of you holding back the right one that is
yeah.
going to
So
carry on any gene is nil.
you carry
So,
you got
do
to
you hold
hold
them
back
all at that
multiples.
point? Do you just
Yeah,
hold them all?
yeah, and they go. Believe it or not, I mean it's kind of controversial, but they do go through that the color change.
Right.
Some people say they don't go through it, but it's pretty clear that they do go through a color change.
Some
I'm
sort of
not
color
sure.
change.
I'm not
And it's
sure if
not
you can call it that ontogenic color
right.
change or
It's
not.
not necessarily that like they go from this to this. There's no like guarantee of what's going to happen, but there is a some sort of change during the sexual maturity
And
time that they shift.
probably the most hilarious part is like the brighter they come out, they're going to they're going to end up kind of darkening with time.
Mhm.
They're not going to be quite as vibrant. And if they come out really dark, they're going to
They're going to
lighten with
lighten up
time.
with time.
So you really can't get what you want. Like when you look at a baby, after the first 3 months, I think you get a better idea with the Amazons of what it's going to look like.
Okay.
So you got to hold them for 3 to 6 months. You got to have a bunch of sheds out. With tigers, the first, usually you get a whole clutch. You can't even tell which ones are tigers
Okay.
until after the first shed or two because they're like this monolithic color.
Okay.
And then after the shed, you'll start to see pinstriping coming in a little bit. And you're like, oh, it's going to be probably orange and red striping
Okay.
on it. So you do have to hold, kind of like with the green trees, where you have to
Yeah.
hold them a little bit longer.
Yeah. Because you don't
With
know what they're going to turn out like. I mean, green trees, you almost have to hold them for an entire year
I hear
until
you
you
can't.
start really seeing
Now
that.
I don't deal with green trees, and there's a reason for it, and we'll get into it sometime. But from what I understand, you can't even sex them till over a year, right?
I usually won't. Most people who breed them will sell them unsexed until they're like over a year old. and that's because their tail and their cloaca, all the bones there are so small and so spaced apart that just the amount of handling required to restrain them and probe them, or trying to pop them, will kink their back forever and can actually stop them from breeding, cause them to have constipation and other issues, and even kill the snake. So most people will leave them unsexed until about at least a year of age. Now,
And you
luckily,
can,
they
yeah.
do grow pretty rapidly comparatively to like emeralds. Like my 2 year old emeralds are half the size of a 2 year old green tree python. And that's partly because of digestive system. Like they have a much higher metabolism. They eat every 3 to 5 days as babies, and then they'll stay at like every 7 days for a long time. Whereas baby emeralds, like right out the gate, can go 2 or 3 weeks without eating.
Interesting. Oh man, making me want
Which
to
is
get into green tree
stressful.
pythons a little bit.
I mean, it's okay to cry.
I know that's the
it
only reason I haven't.
it's I did not, and it could just be me. There's always that story of some guy who is out there who's cohabiting a pair of green tree pythons in a 20-gallon aquarium and gets eggs every year. And then there's me who has like my temperatures within a degree of variance. I have my humidity locked in and it sends it hourly updates to my phone so that I know what the humidity is, and I have automatic misters that I can turn on and change my ventilation and airflow with fans, and I get so technical with it and still not have any success with it. So maybe green trees just aren't my thing. Like
Yeah,
I
maybe they
had
know.
great luck with the emeralds,
Yeah, they
but
know you like boas deep down inside,
maybe that's it. It's
and they don't want to do it for you.
they were mad that I changed. I used to be a green tree guy, and now I'm more of an emerald guy, and so they're taking it out on me.
Mm.
But my wife won't let me get rid of them because Splits was the first one we got when we got back into the game.
Ah, so you're back on that.
So
So you got to stick with that green
I
tree.
gotta I gotta hold on to him, and I'm of the opinion, even if I had the perfect house, perfect food, curated and brought to me, I get to just hang out at the house and be lazy all day. But I didn't have my girl. That ain't paradise. So that means I can't just have the green tree. I got to have a female for him too. He's in there breeding with her right now.
Man, I hope that this year you get eggs,
That would be nice,
and
and
then
hopefully I have more success.
we will be there on the emotional roller coaster that follows.
There we go. We'll do it together.
All right.
Well, that's enough time for this one.
Think
Let's
so?
sign out for the day. Thank you, everybody who is following along with our podcast. If you came out to the show, thank you again for coming to see us. We hope that you come out and see us at the Lakeland and Orlando and Tampa shows upcoming. If you liked our video and like what we talk about, give us a like and subscribe. Comment down below if you'd like to see us talk about other things. And make sure to follow me and Jason on Instagram. You got Kingside Exotics, right?
Yes, sir.
Kingside Exotics, and then Valhalla Exotics on Instagram. We're also on the other socials. You can find those by going through our Instagram there. We'll be posting here on YouTube. And if you want to get any of our merchandise and come and get a 10% discount at the shows, get one of our shirts or hats or some kind of merch and show up and let us know you support the podcast. So we love you guys. Thank you for following us and watching as we go on this reptile journey. Make sure that you guys stay Valhalla bound. We'll
See
see
ya.
you next time.
All right.